Throughout the morning, Vagabond sailed up the bay at a little over 7 knots, and Neil went over the boat, making sure it would be ready for the owner's inspection that night. Vagabond was a fast, roomy trimaran that moved through the water like a strange, three-legged insect skipping from wave to wave. He entered the cabins in the side hull from the 2 side cockpits and went down steps to the long, narrow floor area. The berths were up in the wing area over the water, separated from the main cabin by a plywood and veneer partition. Vagabond was steered from the enclosed wheelhouse and was a little aft of the centre of the boat between the main cabin with its galley and dinette area and Neil's aft cabin. On either side of the wheelhouse were open cockpits with settee seats and the sliding hatchway leading down into the side cabins. All this space meant that people could get away from each other even at sea, and Neil, being a private man, found that important. Almost as important as Vagabond's ability to go fast without heeling in almost any kind of weather. At noon he relinquished the helm to Jim in order to put through a call to Frank at his office in New York City. Jim turned on the transistor radio to catch the news, which was unusual since he usually preferred to listen to music on his cassette tapes. Neil's aft cabin contained only 12 square feet of standing room between his double-berth dead aft and the bulkhead that separated his cabin from the ship's engine compartment. Although it was not as spacious as the cabins in the 2 side hulls, Neil preferred it to any place else aboard. The radio, telephone, a shortwave radio and a chart table had all been installed here. His books were crammed into 2 long shelves. With the large grey radio, the navigational equipment and sparse furnishings, it was a very masculine room. About as pretty as the inside of a tank, as one woman had described it. When the marine operator put the call through to New York, Neil was glad to hear Frank's husky voice. "This stupid war stuff is screwing up everything," Frank announced loudly. "I can't get a flight to Washington. They've booked solid. You think you can meet me today at Crisfield? I can get a flight to Salisbury, Maryland, and then rent a car." Crisfield was a small fishing town about 20 miles away across the bay from Point Lookout. "Sure," he replied. "That's as easy as Point Lookout. What about the Foresters?" "We'll sail Vagabond across the bay and pick them up as soon as you get me. What time do you figure you'll make it to Crisfield?" "If the wind holds or improves, we'll be there by 6 tonight, but if it drops or we're headed—" "Well, do your best," Frank said into the pause. "I know you must be beat. Vagabond's a lot of boat for just 2 men, especially when one of them's a goof-off." "Your son's a good sailor," Neil commented quietly. "Yeah?" Frank replied, surprised at the news. "In that blow-off St. Augustine," Neil went on, "Jim went up the mast when the mainsail jammed. He also took the helm for almost 4 hours and let me sleep through half my watch." "Neil?" Jim's voice broke into conversation from the deck just outside the cabin. "I've got to talk to Dad. There's going to be a war." "What are you talking about?" Neil asked, looking up at Jim. "I just heard the news," Jim went on. "We rejected the Russian offer. Let me speak to Dad." Frank, Jim wants to talk to you," Neil said. "We'll meet you tonight in Crisfield unless we're becalmed. If we are, I'll try to get a message through to Carter's Blue Water Marina. Got it?" "What? Sure, good." Neil hopped up the cabin steps and hurried to the wheel as Jim took over the mic. "Holy Jesus, Dad," Jim said. "We're going to be fighting the Russians. It's going to be a war." At the moment there was a silence on the other end, and then Frank's voice replied slowly and huskily. "Don't worry about it, Jimmy," he said. "This is just another war scare. Just like 3 months ago, just like 2 years ago. This is international poker. And the secret is never to call, just keep raising." "The radio said we rejected their offer of bilateral troop withdrawals," Jim went on. "Why?" "If we withdraw any troops now," said Frank, his husky voice again coming in only after a pause, "we'd be seen as giving in. Our president may be a jerk, but he's a macho jerk, so we can be sure now that our troops are in Arabia. They're going to stay, even if no one's around to kill." "Dad, we ought to take the boat back south," Jim said, gripping the mic in both hands. "When the war starts—" "Now cut that crap," Frank interrupted with abrupt annoyance. "This is just another game of international brinkmanship, and neither their assholes nor our assholes are stupid enough to go to war. The Russians really don't care about Saudi Arabia nomads, and we don't really care about Asian democracy. But we care about oil. Not enough to blow up the world," said Frank. "Now give me Neil. Don't bother. Just hang up and get your ass up to Crisfield." The line went dead. Jim stood alone in the aft cabin. He was angry. He hated the way his father treated him. Since he'd been only an average student and never held a job, his father had always made him feel like he was some kind of good-for-nothing. He enjoyed rock music, playing his guitar, getting high with his friends and partying, making it with Celia or occasionally some other girl. None of these qualified in Frank's eyes as anything but a waste of time. On the 3 or 4 occasions he'd sailed with Frank on Vagabond, there had been a lot of older people aboard who had helped Frank handle the boat. Jim had ended up retreating to his cabin to get stoned and listen to music. His father inevitably come to shout at him to turn it down and to criticise him for not helping more with the sailing. It had been a downer. He didn't even think he liked sailing much until this trip up Florida alone with Neil. He climbed slowly up the ladder from the aft cabin and went back into the wheelhouse. Neil, who'd heard Jim's end of the conversation and its abrupt termination, stared forward. "There's going to be a war," Jim stated angrily, "and Frank doesn't care." Neil glanced at Jim and then back forward. "I don't know," Neil replied. "I suppose it's possible our troops and theirs may be killing each other a month or two. But the world will pretend everyone's a guerrilla and we won't have to call it a war." "But there's a retired general who says we ought to hit Russia before they hit us," said Jim. "And those TV evangelists say the same. If the Russians read that, and they'll have to strike first, don't you see?" "No, Jim. They're going to do it," Jim insisted, his long hair falling down his forehead so it obscured his left eye. He tossed it back angrily. "I know they are. I can feel it." Neil looked forward, reminded of a young sailor on his last patrol who'd panicked while watching B-52s bomb the coast 2 miles away. He knew from Frank that when Jim was 15 he'd had a bad acid trip, hallucinated an imminent nuclear holocaust, and kept insisting that his family leave the country and fly to Australia. He'd had to be sedated for almost 3 weeks. And since then, according to Frank, Jim tended to become upset whenever there was an accident at a nuclear power plant or a nuclear test explosion or the threat of war. There'd been a lot to be upset about in the last 3 weeks. "The Russians aren't going to start a nuclear war," Neil said softly. "Then we are," he shot back. "There's no way the two sides can go on this way. It's going to happen." "Take it easy, Jim," Neil rejoined sharply, putting his hand on Jim's shoulder. "Shouting isn't going to stop anything." "Damn it, you don't care either." Jim stood facing Neil defiantly, but Neil did not look at him. "Look," Neil persisted softly, "it's no more appropriate to get into a panic now than it would be if we were heading into a storm at sea. You just do what has to be done when it has to be done. We should find a fallout shelter, stock up food. Right now," Neil interrupted firmly, "our job is to sail the Vagabond to your father." "Oh, Neil," Jim responded, "it's so sad, it's so—" "Drop it," said Neil. He was staring forward. "Here, take the helm," he went on. "It's still your watch." He walked away into the port cockpit and stood with his back to Jim. The shore was far away and only dimly visible now. He was feeling distinctly uneasy. Jim's fears struck a responsive chord, and he could feel it vibrating in his own gut. A part of him also wanted to return and run back out in the mouth that he felt closing now behind them. His instinct was to get out to sea, away from the mess that men might make on land. He turned back to Jim. "We're meeting Frank in Crisfield instead of Point Lookout," he said quietly. "Our course is changed to 010. You got it?" 010, Jim answered, glancing out once at the compass and beginning to turn the wheel to starboard. As Neil stared ahead, he was surprised to find himself wondering anxiously whether the Vagabond's charts to the West Indies were still aboard. Annoyed at his irrationality, he held himself firmly standing in the port cockpit, staring at the great expanse of bay lying before him. His course was 010, 10 degrees east of north. Getting to Crisfield without an engine was enough to worry about for one day. "I made over $8,000 on my shorts today." No, not that kind of short. Selling stocks short, you know. "He's fine. Captain Loken just told me he was a great sailor. Brought the ship single-handed through a terrific storm when the sail—" "What?" No. There wasn't any storm. I was just exaggerating. He's fine, I tell you. I bet he looks like a bronze Greek god. He's so good-looking it's obscene. Girls will be coming into heat all over Cheapsake. Damn it. No. If there ever was going to be a war, they would have mentioned it in the Wall Street Journal." Yeah, right, sweetheart. "Look, I've got to get going to the airport. 10 days. "Oh, sure, don't worry. Goodbye, honey." "Right, you too. So long." Frowning, Frank hung up. In the last year or two, Nora seemed to be all anxiety, mostly about Jimmy, her baby, but sometimes about everything. Maybe that's where Jimmy got his panic from. He was glad Susan was home from college while he and Jimmy were off cruising. Nora needed company these days, but couldn't join them in Chesapeake until the last weekend of the cruise. Rosie buzzed again. "Mr. Tyler on the line." "Put him on," said Frank, reaching for the phone to speak to George Tyler, a partner in several real estate ventures. "Well, Frank, it was a no-go," Tyler's voice announced loudly, as if all important news had to be shouted. "I'm afraid Mulweather called and gave some cock-and-bull story that boils down to the fact that his client's considering backing out of the West 80th Street deal." "What the hell? Why?" "My guess is that his clients decided that an apartment house, no matter how attractive, tends to lose its cash flow when reduced to rubble." Frank didn't reply, stunned by the sardonic comment. "Well," he said after a pause, "I don't think cash or stocks sitting at Chase are going to retain much of their value either when they're fluttering down over the Atlantic in a million pieces." "I know," said Tyler, in congruous cheerfulness. "What are we going to do?" "Well, Weather found a clause in our preliminary agreement he can back out. In this climate, I think everyone's more interested in vacation in the Terra del Fuego than in negotiating any new business deals." Frank could feel himself becoming unreasonably angry at Merriweather and his clients for being panicked out of a deal that would make good money for all parties concerned. He stared gloomily at his desk. "Okay, George, keep after it," he finally said with a sigh. "Make them feel like they're chicken or something. Maybe they'll change their minds after next week." After Tyler had hung up, Frank felt depressed. Worse, it was getting late. What time was it? Almost 4. Jesus, he had to be at LaGuardia by 5 for his flight to Salisbury, so he'd have to hurry it up. He made one last call to his broker and learned that the Dow Jones Industrial Average was down something like 51 points. The high-priced printer still almost 20 minutes behind. When he hung up, even though he'd made money on his shorting, he was even more depressed. As he rose and began to gather up his things for the boat, he remembered his own favourite acronym with a strange sense of irritation. The stock market never lies.